Come close now, children of blood and memory. Draw your chairs near to this fire that knows more than it tells. What I carry tonight ain't no easy tale to rest in your ears, but it needs telling just the same. Some stories walk among us whether we speak them or not, but silence only feeds their hunger. I am old enough to remember when the earth still held the weight of chains, though my own feet never felt their bite. I carry it because it was carried into me, passed down through hands that knew the texture of cotton and the sting of leather. I am old enough to know how a plantation breathes at night, how the quarters whisper names after the overseer's boots go quiet, how the fire remembers every scream it was forced to swallow. Listen here, folk. Some names were burned into flesh before they were ever spoken aloud. Tonight I speak one such name, and I do not speak it lightly. Her name was Ava, but they called her other things. Things that ain't fit for decent company. But we knew her true. We knew her as Ava of the Fork, and Lord have mercy on what that meant. The old ones warned us about certain kinds of pain. Pain that don't just hurt the body but marks the spirit. Pain that's been measured and weighed like cotton at harvest time. Pain that's been given purpose by men who mistake cruelty for godliness. Ava knew that pain. She wore it like scars that spelled out a language only the suffering could read. Now you see, people, there's different ways to tell such a story. You can tell it clean like they do in books written by folks who never felt the weight of iron around their wrists. You can tell it soft like a lullaby that puts truth to sleep. But Ava's story ain't meant to rest easy. It's meant to burn like the fork that marked her, meant to stay with you like smoke in your clothes. The fire that crackles between us tonight has heard such stories before. It remembers the hush harbors deep in the woods, where our people gathered to speak the names of those who came before. It remembers the prayers that rose like heat from the quarters, carrying up all the sorrow that couldn't be spoken in daylight. That same fire knows Ava's name, knows it like it knows the taste of flesh and the sound of screaming. But don't mistake me, this ain't a story told for the pleasure of horror. This is testimony. This is the accounting of debts that were never paid and wounds that were never allowed to heal proper. Ava's tale is woven into the very fabric of this land, stitched in with blood and tears and the kind of rage that burns slow and steady like oak logs in winter. There was a plantation in Georgia, down in the red clay country where the earth drinks deep and holds on to what it's given. The soil there was rich with iron and darker things, and the air itself felt heavy, like each breath had been counted and would be accounted for. The big house squatted on a rise like a white god watching over its dark kingdom, its windows reflecting nothing but the light it chose to see. In them days of deep sorrow, a plantation was more than land and crops. It was a breathing thing with its own heartbeat, its own hunger. It fed on the labor of stolen people and grew fat on their tears. The fields stretched out like an ocean of green that swallowed men whole and spat out their bones. The quarters huddled low against the earth, wooden boxes where human beings were stored between days of toil. That's where Ava was born, under a sky that owned her before she could open her eyes. The midwife who caught her said she came out fighting, tiny fists already clenched against the world. But even a fighting spirit can be broken if you know the right tools and have enough time. The plantation owner believed he had both. The old folks say you can tell a child's destiny by how they cry when they first taste air. Some come out wailing like they already know what waits for them. Others come out quiet, like they're listening for something the rest of us can't hear. Ava came out with her eyes wide open, taking in the candlelit faces around her, the rough-hewn walls, the weight of sorrow that hung in the air like Spanish moss. From that first breath, Ava belonged to a world that didn't ask her permission to live in it. She was property before she was a person, a number in a ledger before she had a name. But she was also something else, something the plantation owner would never understand until it was too late. She was a child of strong hands and quiet eyes, a little girl who watched everything and forgot nothing. The woman who birthed her worked the big house, cleaning and cooking and keeping her head down like survival required. But late at night, when the master's family slept sound in their feather beds, she would hold Ava close and whisper old songs in words that reached back across the ocean to a homeland none of them would ever see again. Those songs carried medicine for wounds that went deeper than flesh. As Ava grew, she learned the rules that were never written down but always enforced. Keep your eyes down when the white folks pass. Work hard and complain never. Know your place and stay in it, or feel the whip's reminder of who you are. These were the lessons that came with mother's milk, bitter truths that had to be swallowed whole. But even in that place of bondage, love found ways to grow. Ava learned to read the sky for weather and the faces around her for danger. She learned which of the field hands could be trusted and which of the house slaves carried tales back to the master. She learned that survival was a skill that had to be practiced every single day, and she learned it well. Yet there was something in Ava that wouldn't bend complete, no matter how much pressure was applied. The old women saw it in the set of her shoulders when she walked, in the way she looked at you direct when you spoke to her. They recognized the signs because they'd seen them before, in children who carried something extra, something that made them dangerous to those who trafficked in human misery. That child got fire in her, the conjure woman said one evening as she watched Ava play with the other young ones. Question is whether it'll burn her up or burn everything else down. She didn't know then how prophetic her words would prove to be, how that fire would one day meet its match in iron heated white hot in the forge of cruelty. Now listen here, child, for I tell you true. There was no mercy in the ground where Ava learned to walk. The red clay earth of that Georgia plantation had drunk so much blood and sweat, it seemed to pulse like a living thing underneath your feet. Every morning when the horn blew before dawn, that soil would grab at your ankles like it was trying to pull you down to join all the souls that had been worked into it over the years. The big house rose up from that hungry earth like a monument to sin, dressed in white paint and window glass. 3 stories of lies built on the backs of stolen people, with columns that reached toward heaven like the owner thought God approved of his business. Behind it, the quarters stretched out in 2 long rows. Cabins built just close enough to each other that you could hear your neighbor's troubles through the thin walls, but far enough apart that you couldn't do nothing about them. Ava came to know every inch of that place before she could spell her own name. She knew the way the morning light hit the cotton fields, turning them silver before the heat burned off the dew. She knew the sound the gin house made when it was working, like the devil's own music grinding away at something that fought back. She knew which boards in the cabin floor creaked loudest, and how to step around them when the overseer made his night rounds. Lord have mercy, that overseer was a piece of work. Name of Hutchins, and he wore meanness like some men wear cologne, thick enough that you could smell it coming before you saw him. He carried a leather whip that he'd named Sweet Mary, and he talked to it like it was alive. Sweet Mary's hungry this morning, he'd say, stroking the braided leather. Wonder who's gonna feed her today. The plantation owner himself was a different kind of evil altogether. Master Cornelius Thornfield, they called him, though behind closed doors the enslaved folk had other names for him that ain't fit to repeat in decent company. He was a tall, thin man who moved through the world like he was measuring it, calculating how much profit could be squeezed from every acre, every hour, every human being under his dominion. Thornfield believed in what he called scientific management of his property, which was his fancy way of saying he'd studied the most efficient methods of breaking human spirits. He'd read books about it, corresponded with other plantation owners, attended conferences where men in fine clothes discussed the best techniques for maximizing the output of human chattel. He approached cruelty like other men approached religion, with dedication, study, and an unshakable faith in his own righteousness. The man had theories about pain. He believed it could be administered like medicine in precise doses calculated to achieve specific results. Too little and the lesson wouldn't take hold. Too much and you'd damage the property beyond usefulness. But just the right amount, applied with scientific precision, could reshape a human being like a blacksmith shapes iron in his forge. In them days of deep sorrow, Ava learned to move through that world like a shadow, keeping herself small and quiet. She worked in the big house first, helping her mother with the cleaning and serving. Her little hands were good for dusting the fine things that filled the master's parlor. Crystal glasses from England, porcelain plates painted with flowers that had never grown in Georgia soil, books bound in leather that spoke of places she'd never see. But Ava wasn't just cleaning those things, she was studying them, learning the weight of wealth and the texture of privilege. She saw how the master's family lived, how they moved through rooms filled with beauty bought with blood. She watched the mistress of the house, a pale woman who spent her days in nervous exhaustion, fanning herself and complaining about the heat, while other women labored under the same sun with no relief. The master's children were perhaps the most chilling sight of all. Young ones who had learned to see black skin as invisible, who could play games while human beings suffered within their sight. The oldest boy, Master William, was already showing signs of the cruelty that ran in his bloodline like a hereditary disease. He'd kick the dogs that got too close to his food, pull the wings off flies just to watch them struggle, and speak to the enslaved workers like they were pieces of furniture that had somehow learned to talk. "Ava girl, fetch me some water," he'd command, barely looking up from his toys. And when she brought it, he'd sometimes accidentally knock the pitcher from her hands, then call for her to be switched for being clumsy. The child was being educated in the art of ownership, learning that other human beings existed solely for his convenience and amusement. But the most dangerous lessons Ava learned came from watching Master Thornfield himself. She saw how he studied faces when he spoke, looking for signs of rebellion or resistance. She watched him calculate in his head as he walked through the quarters, counting heads and measuring productivity, like a merchant taking inventory of his goods. She observed the way he touched things, his crops, his horses, his human property, with the same casual possessiveness. The land itself seemed to reflect the poison of its ownership. The cotton fields stretched out like white seas under the brutal sun, beautiful from a distance but deadly up close. The plants demanded constant tending, constant labor, and the bowls opened sharp and mean, cutting fingers that weren't careful. Blood on cotton was so common that the workers barely noticed it anymore, red drops disappearing into white fiber like it had never been. Behind the plantation proper lay the darker places, the swamplands where runaway slaves sometimes tried to hide, where gators and snakes made homes among the cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. The bayous held their own mysteries and dangers, but they also held a kind of freedom that existed nowhere else on the plantation. In those wet, green places, a person could disappear into the landscape and become something other than property, at least for a little while. The quarters themselves told their own story of human endurance. Each cabin housed 2 families, sometimes more when children started coming. The walls were thin boards that let in every sound and weather, and the floors were just packed earth that turned to mud when the rains came. But within those humble spaces, people created something Master Thornfield could never understand or purchase, communities of love and resistance that sustained them through the darkest times. Ava learned to read the signs that passed between the adults, the lifted eyebrows and tilted heads that communicated volumes without words. She learned which songs carried secret messages about escape routes or danger, and which prayers were actually curses disguised as supplications to the white man's god. She discovered that even in the most degraded circumstances, human beings found ways to preserve their dignity and maintain their connections to something larger than their suffering. The spiritual life of the quarters was rich with traditions that reached back across the ocean to African shores. The old conjure woman, Aunt Zilpha, kept the ancient knowledge alive, teaching those who needed to know about roots and herbs, about the proper way to speak to the spirits, about protection against both earthly and otherworldly evils. Her cabin always smelled of strange things, sulfur and sage, graveyard dirt and holy water, and children were warned to show proper respect when they passed her threshold. At night, when the masters slept and the patrollers dozed, the quarters came alive with a different energy. Stories were shared that would never see daylight, songs were sung that carried the names of the lost, and plans were whispered that would have meant death if overheard. It was in these midnight hours that Ava began to understand that she was part of something larger than herself, connected to a chain of resistance that stretched back through generations of the enslaved. But even as she learned these lessons of survival and community, Ava could feel something else growing inside her, something that watched Master Thornfield with calculating eyes, something that studied his movements and habits with the patience of a hunter. The fire the conjure woman had seen in her was still burning, and it was feeding on every injustice she witnessed, every casual cruelty she endured. Every night she went to sleep on an empty stomach while the big house blazed with light and abundance. The day was coming when that fire would need more fuel than patience could provide. But first, there would be other lessons to learn, other horrors to witness. The auction block was waiting, and with it the education that would teach Ava the true depth of the evil she was born into. Some knowledge comes gentle, like morning light through a window. Other knowledge hits like lightning, burning its truth into your very bones. Lord help us all, but there ain't no sound in this world more terrible than the sound of the auction block. I tell you this because you need to know, because forgetting is the second death that follows the first. Ava was only 7 years old the first time she heard it. That peculiar silence that falls when human beings are reduced to livestock, punctuated by voices calling out prices like they was bidding on horses or hogs. It was a Tuesday in September, hot enough that the air shimmered like water over the road. Master Thornfield had some debts to settle, and debt in them days was paid in flesh as often as coin. The word had gone out through the quarters like fever. There was to be a selling, not just the troublemakers or the old ones too broken for work, but families with strong backs and children who could be trained up right. "Gather round," the overseer Hutchins called, cracking Sweet Mary against his boot. "Master wants to see all his property lined up nice and neat. Every soul on this plantation better be standing in that yard in 10 minutes, or Sweet Mary's gonna get acquainted with your backs." The enslaved people came slow and reluctant, like mourners at a funeral, because that's what it was, a funeral for the living. Ava held tight to her mother's hand, feeling the tremor in those strong fingers that had washed countless dishes and folded endless laundry for the big house. The woman who had birthed her was scared, though she tried not to let it show. Fear was dangerous. Fear could be smelled like smoke, and Master Thornfield had a nose for it. The auction block itself was nothing but a wooden platform raised up about 3 feet off the ground, weathered gray from sun and rain and tears. But it might as well have been an altar to some cruel god, the way people looked at it with such dread. Beside it stood a wooden post with iron rings set into it, rusty from use and weather. That's where they'd chain folks if they fought too hard against being examined like cattle. The buyers came in wagons and on horseback, white men with calculating eyes and ledger books tucked under their arms. Some wore fine clothes, plantation owners from other counties looking to expand their operations. Others were rough-dressed traders who bought humans like other men bought corn, selling them down the river to whoever paid best. They all had that same look, though, the expression of men who saw dollar signs where God had put souls. Master Thornfield stood beside the block in his Sunday clothes, playing the part of the gracious host, even as he prepared to destroy lives with the stroke of a pen. He'd had his hair pomaded and his mustache waxed for the occasion, wanting to present the proper image for his business associates. Nothing must interfere with commerce, not even the sound of children crying for their mothers. The auctioneer was a fat man with a voice like a bull bellowing across a pasture. He'd done this work before. You could tell by the way he handled the people being sold, prodding them like livestock, checking their teeth and muscles with practiced efficiency. He had no interest in their names or their histories. To him, they were just inventory to be moved, problems to be solved with the highest bid. "Now, folks, we got some fine property here today," he called out, mopping his sweating face with a stained handkerchief. "Prime field hands, house servants trained proper, breeding stock guaranteed healthy. Let's start the bidding with this young buck here." They started with Big Moses, a man who could lift a cotton bale like other men lifted sacks of grain. He'd been born on the plantation, had a wife and 3 children living in the quarters. Now he stood on that block with his head held high, refusing to show the fear that was eating him alive from the inside. The bidding was brisk. Strong men were always in demand. Sold for $800 to Mr. Patterson from Valdosta. Just like that, Big Moses belonged to another man, would work different fields, sleep in different quarters. His wife Sarah let out a sound like a wounded animal when the gavel fell, and their youngest boy, no more than 4 years old, started calling Daddy, Daddy, in a voice that cut through all the other noise like a knife through butter. But the selling was just getting started. One by one, they called people up onto that block, stripping them of their names and their dignity, reducing them to ages and descriptions and market value. A good breeding wench, 22 years old, strong hips. A likely houseboy, well-trained and obedient. An old man, good with horses, some years left in him yet. Families were split like kindling, children torn from mother's arms as easy as picking flowers. The buyers didn't care about love or kinship. Those were luxuries that enslaved people couldn't afford to have. A mother might bring one price, her children another, and economic efficiency demanded that they go to whoever paid most, whether that kept them together or scattered them to the four winds. Ava watched it all with eyes that grew older by the minute. She saw Mrs. Jenny, who'd taught her how to fold linens proper, sold to a man from Alabama who specialized in working his people to death within 5 years. She saw young Tom, barely 14 but strong as a mule, go to a rice plantation where the fever killed more folks than old age ever would. She saw babies sold away from their mothers before they was even weaned, crying for milk that would never come again. The worst was when they called the Carter family up together. Mama, Daddy, and 3 young ones ranging from 5 to 12 years old. The parents held hands on that block, trying to shield their children from the examining hands of the buyers. But economic reality had no patience for sentiment. "Now here's a fine family group," the auctioneer called, "but I'm authorized to sell them separate if the bidding warrants it." The daddy, a man named Samuel who'd always greeted Ava with a smile and a kind word, tried to speak up. "Please, sirs, we beg you, keep us together. We'll work twice as hard, give no trouble. Just don't—" "Shut your mouth, boy," one of the buyers snapped. "Property don't negotiate terms." In the end, they were split 4 ways. Mama to a cotton plantation in South Carolina, Daddy to a tobacco farm in Virginia, the oldest child to a sugar mill in Louisiana. The 2 youngest sold together to a family in Tennessee. The sound of their crying followed the buyers' wagons down the dusty road long after they disappeared from sight. But it was when they called up Annie Pearl and her baby girl that something broke inside Ava. Something that would never be whole again. Annie Pearl was barely 18, with a 6-month-old daughter still nursing at her breast. She'd been brought to the plantation the year before, already carrying the child, sold by a master who'd gotten tired of her tears. The baby was fussing, hungry, and frightened by all the noise and strange voices. Annie Pearl tried to comfort her while the buyers examined them both like livestock, checking the mother's teeth, feeling her arms for muscle, discussing her breeding potential right in front of her like she couldn't hear. "Separate them," one buyer finally declared. "I need a wet nurse for my wife's new baby, but I got no use for another mouth to feed. Sell the pickaninny to someone else." "No!" Annie Pearl's voice cut through the morning air like breaking glass. "Please, dear God in heaven, no. She's just a baby. She needs me. I'll do anything you ask, but please don't take my child." But business was business, and sentiment was bad for profit margins. They pulled that baby from her mother's arms while Annie Pearl screamed like the world was ending. Which, for her, it was. The baby went to a family in Macon who wanted a playmate for their own child. Annie Pearl went to a plantation outside Savannah, where her milk dried up from grief within a week. Standing in that dusty yard, holding tight to her mother's hand, Ava felt something change inside her. The fire the conjure woman had seen was feeding on what she witnessed, growing hotter and more dangerous with every family torn apart, every child separated from its parents, every human being reduced to property and profit. The older enslaved people tried to shield the young ones from the worst of it, turning their faces away when the examining got too rough, humming spirituals under their breath to drown out the crying. But Ava wouldn't look away. She stared at every horror, memorizing every injustice, letting the images burn themselves into her mind like brands. "Lord Almighty," her mother whispered, tears running down her cheeks. "What kind of world is this where such things can be?" Ava didn't answer, but she was learning the answer all the same. It was a world where power was everything and mercy was nothing. A world where white skin was worth more than a black soul, where money mattered more than love. A world that needed changing, no matter what the cost. When the auction was finally over and the buyers had gone home with their new property, the quarters felt like a graveyard. The cabins where whole families had lived the night before now echoed with emptiness. Children cried for parents who would never come back. Husbands and wives mourned for spouses sold downriver to places where yellow fever and overwork killed the enslaved faster than they could be replaced. That night, the conjure woman Aunt Zilpha called the survivors together in her cabin. She burned sage and sweetgrass, sprinkled graveyard dirt in the corners, and spoke words in a language that reached back across the ocean to African shores. "The spirits are restless tonight," she said, her ancient voice crackling like dry leaves. "They seen what happened today and they ain't pleased. Change is coming, children. I can smell it on the wind like rain before a storm." Ava sat in the back of that crowded cabin, listening to the old woman's words and feeling the truth of them in her bones. Change was coming indeed. It was growing inside her like a seed planted in bloody ground, watered by tears and fed by rage. The auction block had taught her the true nature of the world she lived in, and that knowledge would shape everything that followed. Some lessons you learn with your mind, others you learn with your heart. But the hardest lessons, the ones that change you forever, those you learn with your soul. And on that terrible Tuesday in September, standing in the shadow of the auction block, 7-year-old Ava learned what her soul was truly made of. The fire was spreading and soon it would need fuel. Soon, very soon, it would demand satisfaction. Now listen here, children, for I must tell you about the man who believed pain could teach better than God himself. Master Cornelius Thornfield wasn't born evil. No, that would be too simple, too easy to dismiss. Evil like his was cultivated, studied, refined like sugar in a mill, until it was pure white and deadly sweet. Lord have mercy on my soul for speaking his name. But speak it I must, because forgetting is the second slavery that follows the first. Thornfield came from money, old Charleston money that had been washing itself clean with rice and cotton profits for 3 generations. His daddy had taught him that enslaved people were like fine horses. They needed breaking proper, and once broken, they'd serve faithful till they dropped dead in their traces. But young Cornelius thought his daddy was too soft, too sentimental. The old man would sometimes show mercy, would hesitate before ordering the lash, would allow families to stay together if it didn't cost him too much profit. Such weakness, Cornelius believed, was what kept the South from reaching its full potential. What was needed was scientific management, cold calculation, the efficient application of suffering as a tool of control. He'd studied at the College of Charleston, where professors taught courses on the proper management of human property alongside mathematics and philosophy. He'd read every book written on the subject, treatises by men who approached cruelty like engineers approached bridge building, with careful measurement and precise application of force. Pain, they argued, was simply another tool in the arsenal of control, no different from locks or chains or whips. But Thornfield went further than his teachers ever dared. He believed that fear could be implanted like a seed and cultivated like a crop. That terror, properly applied, could be passed down through generations, making each succeeding population of enslaved people more docile than the last. He saw himself as a scientist of suffering, conducting experiments in human endurance and breaking points. The man kept journals, written in his careful script, documenting his methods and their results. Subject showed defiance after standard 20 lashes, he might write. Applied heated iron to shoulder. Compliance achieved within 48 hours. He recorded everything. What broke the strong ones, what terrorized the children, what made the proud ones beg. In his mind, he was contributing to human knowledge, advancing the science of control. Sweet Jesus, but that man had theories about everything. He believed that enslaved people felt pain differently than white folks, that their nerves were somehow less sensitive, their capacity for suffering somehow greater. This wasn't just cruelty talking, it was educated cruelty, learned cruelty, the kind that comes with degrees and references and the approval of society's finest minds. The plantation became his laboratory, and every soul on it became his test subjects. He experimented with different methods of punishment, different schedules of work and rest, different combinations of reward and terror. He measured everything: how much food was needed to keep a person working but not strong enough to rebel, how much sleep was required to maintain productivity, how much pain could be inflicted without damaging valuable property. But fire was his specialty, his particular area of expertise. Thornfield had discovered that burning flesh created a special kind of terror, a fear that went deeper than the whip or the chain. Fire was immediate and intimate, impossible to ignore or endure with stoic silence. Fire demanded response, demanded acknowledgement, demanded submission. He'd had his blacksmith forge special tools, iron implements that could be heated to precise temperatures and applied to exact locations on the human body. Different shapes for different purposes, different sizes for different lessons. He'd studied anatomy to know which areas would cause maximum pain without affecting a person's ability to work. Everything was calculated, measured, refined. The overseer Hutchins thought his master was touched in the head, but he followed orders because that's what kept bread on his table. Master's got strange ideas about discipline, he'd muttered to himself while heating the irons. But he pays regular, and that's more than most can say. What Hutchins didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Thornfield wasn't interested in simple discipline. He was pursuing something far more ambitious, the complete reconstruction of human nature itself. He wanted to create a new kind of enslaved person, one incapable of rebellion, incapable even of imagining freedom. Through careful application of trauma, he believed he could breed the very concept of resistance out of future generations. The man had read about experiments in France, studies of how pain affected the mind and memory. He'd corresponded with doctors who claimed they could cure madness through controlled application of suffering. If the human spirit could be broken scientifically, systematically, then slavery could become something more than mere economic arrangement. It could become a permanent condition of the soul. Ava first came to his attention after the auction, when he was reviewing his remaining property and planning their most efficient deployment. She was young but strong, intelligent but not yet rebellious. Perfect, he thought, for a long-term study in systematic conditioning. He would document her case carefully, chart her progress from defiant child to broken woman, creating a blueprint that could be applied to others. He watched her for weeks before making his move, studying her habits and relationships, identifying her sources of strength so they could be systematically eliminated. He saw how she held her head high when she walked, how she looked adults in the eye when they spoke to her, how she comforted smaller children when they cried. All of this would have to be beaten out of her, burned away until nothing remained but compliance. The choice of the fork wasn't accidental. Thornfield selected his tools as carefully as a surgeon. A branding iron left a mark that healed and faded, but a fork could be applied again and again to the same location, reopening wounds, preventing healing, creating permanent damage that would serve as a constant reminder. The tines could be heated to different temperatures, creating variations in pain intensity. It was, in his mind, the perfect instrument for his purposes. He scheduled the first session for a Tuesday morning, after the others had gone to the fields. Privacy was important, not for mercy's sake, but for scientific accuracy. Witnesses could contaminate the results, could provide comfort that would interfere with the breaking process. This had to be done in isolation, with careful attention to every detail. The night before, he prepared his journal, sharpening his pen and mixing fresh ink. This would be a landmark case, he believed, a perfect demonstration of his theories put into practice. He would document everything, every cry, every plea, every sign of resistance giving way to submission. Future generations of plantation owners would study his work and marvel at its efficiency. Standing in his study that evening, reviewing his plans by lamplight, Cornelius Thornfield felt the satisfaction of a man embarking on important work. He had no idea that he was setting in motion events that would end with him lying blind and bloody on the same floor where he now planned his scientific cruelties. Some men plant seeds of corn, others plant seeds of cotton. But Thornfield was planting seeds of vengeance, and the harvest would be more terrible than he could imagine. The fire was ready, the tools were prepared. The subject had been selected. All that remained was the careful application of scientific principles to human flesh, and Thornfield was confident in his methods. After all, he believed pain could teach better than God himself. How wrong he was. How terribly, fatally wrong. Suffering so bad. But I got to tell you about the day the iron first kissed Ava's skin. Lord of glory, there ain't no easy way to speak such truth, but truth it is, and truth must be told. Some marks on the body heal clean. Others leave scars that tell stories. But the mark that was put on Ava that morning, that mark was meant to write a new chapter in her soul, to rewrite who she was from the inside out. It was a Tuesday morning in October, crisp and clear, the kind of day when the autumn light makes even the cotton fields look almost beautiful. But beauty can hide the ugliest truths, and that morning carried a heaviness that even the birds seemed to feel. They was quiet in the trees, like they knew something terrible was walking among the living. Master Thornfield had sent word the night before. Ava was to report to the blacksmith shed at first light, alone. No explanation given, no reason stated. Masters don't explain themselves to their property, but the old ones knew. They could smell trouble coming like smoke on the wind, and they tried in their own way to prepare her. "Child," Aunt Zilpha whispered, pressing a small pouch into Ava's palm. "You keep this close to your heart. It ain't gonna stop what's coming, but it might help you hold on to who you are when they try to take it from you." The pouch was warm and smelled of roots and things that grew in shadow. Gopher dust, maybe, or graveyard dirt blessed under a full moon. Ava's mother held her close that morning, longer than usual, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "remember that you are mine, not his. Remember where you come from. Remember who you are." But standing outside that blacksmith shed as the sun came up red as blood, Ava felt like she was about to forget everything she'd ever known about herself. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and it stood slightly open like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. From inside came the sound of fire crackling and the smell of heated metal. Thornfield was waiting for her, dressed in his fine clothes like he was going to church instead of committing sin. Beside him stood the blacksmith, a freedman named Moses who'd bought his own liberty years before, but still had to do whatever work kept food in his family's bellies. The man's face was stone, but his eyes held apologies he couldn't speak. "Come in, girl," Thornfield commanded, his voice mild as milk but with something underneath that made Ava's skin crawl. "We have some teaching to do this morning." The shed was dim inside, lit only by the forge fire that glowed like the devil's own eye in the corner. Tools hung from the walls, hammers and tongs and things whose purposes Ava couldn't name, but which all seemed designed for shaping metal and breaking things that didn't want to break. In the center of the space stood a wooden table, scarred from use, with iron rings set into its edges. "Do you know why you're here?" Thornfield asked, walking slowly around her like he was inspecting livestock. His boots clicked on the dirt floor, measuring out a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. Ava kept her mouth shut and her eyes down. She'd learned that answering back only made things worse, that silence was sometimes the only defense a person had. But inside, her heart was beating like African drums, calling out to ancestors she'd never met, but somehow knew were listening. "You're here because you need to understand something important," Thornfield continued, stopping in front of her. "You need to understand that you belong to me. Not just your labor, not just your time, but your very flesh and blood. Every breath you take is mine to give or take away." He gestured to the blacksmith, who reluctantly began working the bellows, feeding air to the fire until it blazed white-hot. In that fire, Moses placed an iron tool, not a regular branding iron with a letter or symbol, but something stranger. A common kitchen fork, its tines glowing red as they heated. "This," Thornfield said, lifting the fork with a pair of tongs, "is going to help you remember who you are. Or rather, who you aren't. You aren't Ava. You aren't your mother's daughter. You aren't a child with dreams or hopes or ideas about herself. You are my property, and this mark will remind you of that fact every day for the rest of your natural life. The first touch of the iron was like lightning made solid, like the sun itself had reached down to brand her shoulder. Ava's vision went white, then black, then white again. She heard screaming and realized it was coming from her own throat. The smell of burning flesh filled the shed. Her flesh, her pain made visible in smoke that rose up like a prayer asking God why he allowed such things. But even as her body convulsed in agony, something in Ava's mind stepped back and watched with cold calculation. She memorized the feel of the heated iron, the exact pressure Thornfield applied, the length of time he held it against her skin. She studied his face as he worked, noting the careful concentration, the scientific detachment with which he approached her suffering. "Very good," he murmured, pulling the fork away and examining the 4 neat holes it had burned in her shoulder. "Clear marks, proper depth. This will heal nicely and serve as an excellent reminder." He set the fork back in the fire to heat again, while he made notes in a leather journal, writing down observations about her reactions, her cries, her attempts to pull away from the iron. Everything was data to him, information to be collected and analyzed for future reference. "Now," he said, retrieving the fork once more, "let's ensure the lesson takes proper hold." The second application was to her other shoulder, and this time Ava was ready for it. Not ready to endure it. There was no preparing for such pain, but ready to hold on to herself while it happened. She bit down on her tongue until she tasted blood, used that sharp flavor to anchor herself to something real, while the fire tried to burn away everything she was. The old conjure woman's pouch seemed to grow warm against her chest, and for a moment, just a moment, Ava felt like she wasn't alone in that shed, like other presences stood watching, waiting, their own anger building like storm clouds on the horizon. Thornfield burned her 4 times that first morning, twice on each shoulder, creating a pattern that would mark her as his particular property. Between each application, he made his careful notes, documenting her responses, refining his technique. When it was finished, he seemed satisfied with his work. "This is only the beginning," he told her, as Moses applied a rough salve to the wounds. "We'll be continuing your education regularly. By the time I'm finished with you, you'll understand exactly what you are and what you owe to the man who owns you." Walking back to the quarters on unsteady legs, Ava felt like she was carrying a fire inside her chest that had nothing to do with the burns on her shoulders. The pain was terrible, but it was clean somehow, honest in a way that the smiles and false kindness of the big house never were. This was the truth of slavery stripped of all pretense, and knowing the truth, seeing it clearly, gave her a strange kind of strength. The other enslaved people looked at her with eyes full of sorrow and recognition. They'd seen such marks before, worn them themselves or watched others receive them. But there was something in Ava's face that was different, not the broken look of the truly beaten, but the hard gleam of metal that had been tested in fire and found it would not melt. That night, Aunt Zilpha cleaned her wounds with water that had been blessed under a dark moon and whispered words in languages that reached back across the ocean to shores none of them would ever see again. "Child," she said softly, "that man thinks he put his mark on you today. But marks work both ways. Fire don't just burn, it also teaches, and some lessons ain't the ones the teacher meant to give." Lying in her narrow bed, staring up at the rafters while pain throbbed through her shoulders like a second heartbeat, Ava understood what the old woman meant. Thornfield thought he had branded her with ownership, marked her as his property. But the fire had taught her something else entirely. It had shown her the exact shape and weight of the hatred she would carry for the rest of her days. The first mark wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a long education in pain, yes, but also the beginning of something else. Something that would grow in the dark like roots pushing through hard ground. Something that would feed on every subsequent cruelty until it was strong enough to push back. The fire had spoken to her that day, and its message was clear. Remember everything. Every burn, every cry, every moment of agony. Remember it all, because someday the fire would speak again, and when it did, the conversation would be very different indeed. Great God Almighty, But I must tell you about the counting. 500 times that fork touched living flesh. 500 separate lessons in what it meant to be considered less than human. Lord, forgive me for speaking such numbers, but numbers is all Master Thornfield cared about. Numbers and measurements in the scientific application of suffering. It started the week after that first burning, and it went on like the torments of Job himself. Every Tuesday and Friday, regular as church bells, Ava was summoned to that blacksmith shed where Moses worked the bellows with tears running down his face, and Thornfield pursued his unholy studies. The man had a calendar marked with appointments for cruelty, a schedule of agony planned out months in advance. Consistency is key, he'd mutter while he worked, speaking to himself more than to his victim. Random violence teaches nothing, but systematic measured pain. That creates lasting change in the subject's behavior patterns. Each session was documented in his leather journal with the care of a scientist, recording important discoveries. Day 1. Subject showed initial resistance. Crying ceased after third application. Day 7. Notable decrease in defiant behavior. Eyes remained downcast when addressed. Day 14. Physical conditioning proceeding as expected. Psychological conditioning requires additional pressure. But Thornfield wasn't just burning flesh randomly. He was creating a map of ownership on Ava's body, marking her like territory claimed in some twisted war. The fork left neat patterns of 4 holes each time, and he placed them with careful precision. Shoulders, arms, back, anywhere that wouldn't interfere with her ability to work but would serve as permanent reminders of who held dominion over her. The enslaved people in the quarters started calling her the Marked One, but not with pity. There was something else in their voices, recognition maybe, or fear of something they saw growing behind her eyes. The burns healed slowly, leaving scars that looked like strange writing, like someone had tried to spell out a message in raised flesh that only the spirits could read. Aunt Zilpha tended the wounds each night with mixtures that smelled of the earth after rain and things that grew in darkness. "Child," she whispered one evening as she dabbed salve on fresh burns, "your body's becoming a book of suffering. But books can be read different ways, depending on who's doing the looking." By the 10th session, Ava had stopped crying out when the iron touched her, not because the pain was any less, Lord knows it wasn't, but because something in her had learned to step aside from the agony, to watch it from a distance like it was happening to someone else. She discovered she could float above her own body, could observe Thornfield's careful procedures with the same scientific detachment he showed. "Interesting," he noted in his journal after the 20th burning. "Subject appears to be developing psychological defense mechanisms. Pain tolerance increasing. May need to adjust methodology." But Ava wasn't just developing tolerance. She was developing memory. Each application of the fork taught her something new about her captor. She learned the rhythm of his breathing when he worked, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching, the particular smell of fear sweat that clung to him despite his carefully maintained appearance of control. By the 50th session, the pattern was clear. Thornfield burned her on Tuesdays and Fridays, always at the same time, always following the same ritual. He heated the fork in the same fire, made the same careful notes, cleaned the wounds with the same harsh efficiency. Routine was part of his method, predictable cruelty that would eventually break down her resistance through sheer repetition. But routine is a double-edged thing. While Thornfield thought he was conditioning her to helplessness, Ava was learning his weaknesses, cataloging his habits, studying him the way a hunter studies prey. She memorized which tools he favored, where he kept his keys, how the shadows fell in the shed at different times of day. The 100th burning fell on a Friday in December, cold wind whistling through the gaps in the shed walls. Thornfield seemed pleased with his progress, though Ava's resistance hadn't broken the way he'd expected. If anything, she'd grown quieter, more watchful, like a cat that's learned patience from watching mice. 100 precise applications, he murmured, adding fresh ink to his careful tally. The subject's compliance has increased marginally, though complete psychological restructuring requires additional sessions. Physical conditioning appears excellent. Scarring is uniform and permanent. By the 200th mark, other plantation owners had started visiting to observe Thornfield's methods. They came in fine carriages dressed in their Sunday clothes to watch a child systematically tortured in the name of scientific management. They took notes of their own, discussing techniques and results like they were studying a new method of crop rotation. "Remarkable consistency," one visitor observed, examining Ava's scarred arms like she was livestock. "How many applications before you achieved complete compliance?" "The process is ongoing," Thornfield replied proudly. "Complete psychological reconstruction requires patience and systematic application of principles. This subject will serve as a perfect example for future conditioning programs." But they were all missing something crucial, something that Aunt Zilpha saw clearly when she looked at Ava's eyes in the lamplight each evening. The fire wasn't breaking her. It was forging her, heating her spirit to temperatures that made it harder, more flexible, more dangerous. "Child," the old woman said one night after the 300th burning, "you carrying something now that wasn't there before, something that burns without flame, cuts without blade. You feel it yet?" Ava nodded slowly, understanding flooding through her like cold water. Each application of the fork had been meant to diminish her, to make her smaller and more obedient. But pain, it turned out, could teach lessons the teacher never intended. It could show you the exact shape of injustice, could map the territory of cruelty so precisely that you knew exactly where to strike back. The 400th session was different. Thornfield noticed it immediately. A change in Ava's posture, in the way she looked at the heated iron without flinching. Where before she'd submitted to the burns with quiet endurance, now there was something calculating in her stillness. "Subject appears to have reached a new stage in conditioning," he wrote that night. "Previous patterns of response no longer evident. Recommend increased frequency of sessions to maintain psychological pressure." But Ava wasn't reaching a new stage of submission. She was approaching something else entirely. Each burn had added to a growing tally in her mind, a careful accounting of debts that would someday need to be paid. She was memorizing not just the pain, but everything that surrounded it. The way the forge fire sounded when it was hot enough for the work. The weight of the tongs in Thornfield's soft hands. The exact angle at which he had to lean over her to apply the iron. By the time the fork touched her flesh for the 500th time, Ava had become something Thornfield didn't recognize, something his scientific theories hadn't accounted for. She wasn't broken. She wasn't trained. She wasn't reformed. She was educated, but not in the lessons he'd meant to teach. 500 applications completed, he wrote in his journal that final evening, his handwriting shakier than usual. Expected psychological profile not achieved. Subject shows signs of unusual adaptation to conditioning process. Recommend consultation with colleagues before proceeding to next phase. What Thornfield didn't understand, what his books and theories and careful observations had failed to teach him, was that fire is a teacher with its own curriculum. It doesn't just burn, it tempers. And some metals, when heated properly and repeatedly, don't break or bend or melt. They become something harder than they were before, something with edges sharp enough to cut the hand that holds them. Standing in his study that night, reviewing his notes by lamplight, Cornelius Thornfield felt the first stirring of doubt about his methods. The subject was scarred according to plan, marked permanently as his property, but something in her eyes when he'd removed the fork for the final time had made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. It was the look of someone who had learned everything they needed to know and was simply waiting for the right moment to apply that knowledge. The look of a student who had been paying very careful attention to lessons the teacher thought he was giving, but had actually been learning something entirely different. The counting was finished. 500 burns, 500 lessons in cruelty, 500 opportunities to study the man who believed pain could reshape human nature. Ava's education was complete, but not in the way Thornfield intended. The fire had spoken, and she had listened. Soon, very soon, it would be time for her to speak back. The next conversation would be conducted in a language Thornfield had taught her, but with grammar rules he'd never imagined. Some lessons once learned cannot be unlearned. And some teachers, once their work is done, discover that their students have become more dangerous than they ever dreamed possible. Listen here, child, for I must tell you about the women who knew. In them days of deep sorrow, there was wisdom that moved like underground water, flowing from grandmother to mother to daughter, in whispers and glances and hands that knew how to heal more than flesh. The old women could read signs that escaped younger eyes. They could smell trouble coming like smoke on the wind, could see death walking among the living, could recognize when a soul was being forged in fire instead of broken by it. After the 100th burning, when Ava's body had become a map of carefully planned cruelty, it was Aunt Zilpha who first spoke the truth that others feared to name. The conjure woman was older than anyone could remember, her hair white as cotton, and her eyes black as midnight water. She'd been born in the islands where the old ways still ran strong, where spirits walked close to the living, and the ancestors spoke through dreams and signs. "Come here to me, marked child," she called one evening as Ava walked slow and careful back from another session in the blacksmith shed. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen more than most folks could bear, and had learned to bear it anyway. These old hands got work to do. Aunt Zilpha's cabin sat at the far end of the quarters, where the shadows fell deepest and the other enslaved people walked careful when they passed. It was built different from the rest, older, with marks carved into the door frame that looked like nothing to white eyes but spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. Bottles hung from the eaves, green and blue glass catching what light there was, and throwing it back in patterns that made some folks nervous. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of roots and herbs, graveyard dirt and holy water. Sulfur and sage all mixed together in combinations that reached back across the ocean, to knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage, hidden in the minds of stolen people. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters like sleeping bats, and candles flickered in corners where shadows seemed to move on their own. "Sit yourself down," the old woman commanded, gesturing to a low stool beside the fire. "These marks you wearing tell a story, but it ain't the story that white man thinks he's writing." Her hands moved over Ava's scarred arms and shoulders, with the delicate touch of someone reading Braille, fingers tracing the patterns of burned flesh like they was letters in some ancient alphabet. Where she touched, the pain seemed to drain away, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her voice crackling like dry leaves. "Child, you carrying more than scars here. You carrying promises, angry promises that been planted deep and watered with blood." She reached into a wooden chest that sat beside her bed, pulling out items that glinted in the firelight, small bones, smooth stones, pieces of metal that had been shaped by hands more skilled than any blacksmith. Each item went into a leather pouch that she worked with thread so fine it looked like spider silk. "This here's protection," she explained, holding up the finished charm. "Not the kind that stops bullets or turns blades. Ain't no conjure strong enough to shield you from everything this world can do. But it's protection for the part of you that matters most. Your soul, child. Your true self. The part that white man been trying to burn away." She pressed the pouch into Ava's palm, closing her fingers around it with hands that felt like dry bark, but held strength that had endured decades of struggle. "You keep this close to your heart. And when the time comes, and it will come sure as sunrise, you remember what I tell you now. Fire don't just destroy, fire transforms, and some things, once they've been through the flame, come out harder than they was before." Other women began visiting Aunt Zilpha's cabin in the evenings that followed, drawn by something they couldn't name, but recognized in their bones. Sarah, whose husband had been sold at auction, brought herbs she'd gathered from the edges of the swampland. Mary, who worked the big house kitchen, shared whispered stories of things she'd seen and heard that might prove useful someday. Even young Susanna, barely 16 but already marked by the overseer's attention, came seeking wisdom about survival in a world that saw her as nothing but property. They formed a circle around Ava in that flickering candlelight, these women who carried the accumulated wisdom of survival, and they shared what they knew. How to read the signs that meant trouble coming, how to move through the big house without being noticed, how to speak in voices that sounded submissive but carried different meanings to those who knew how to listen, how to remember everything while appearing to forget. "The masters think we empty vessels," Aunt Zilpha said, her voice low and rhythmic like a prayer or an incantation. "Think we just bodies for working and bleeding and breaking. But they wrong, children. We vessels, yes, but we filled with things they can't see, can't touch, can't burn away no matter how hot they make their irons." She told them about the ancestors who had walked before them, spirits of those who had endured the Middle Passage, who had survived the auction block, who had died with their names unspoken but their strength passed down through bloodlines that no chain could break. She spoke of African queens who had ruled empires, of warriors who had fought with spear and shield, of wise women who had known the secrets of root and herb and the healing power of the earth itself. "You think you alone in this suffering," she said, looking directly at Ava. "But you part of something bigger, part of a story that started before you was born and will continue after you gone. The pain you carrying, it ain't just yours. It's the pain of all our people, concentrated in you like medicine in a bottle. Strong medicine, child, the kind that can kill or cure depending on how it's used." Night after night, they gathered in that sacred space, these women who knew. They taught Ava things that no white person would ever understand. How to wrap her true thoughts in words that sounded harmless. How to appear broken while keeping her spirit intact. How to watch and wait and remember everything for the day when memory would become ammunition. "Patience ain't just waiting," Sarah told her, mixing a salve that would help the burns heal clean. "Patience is preparation. Every day you endure is another day you learn something useful about the enemy." Mary shared intelligence from the big house, which members of the master's family were cruel and which were merely indifferent. When Thornfield met with visitors and what they discussed, where the keys were kept, and which doors stayed unlocked. Information that seemed meaningless by itself, but might prove valuable when combined with other knowledge. "Knowledge is power," she whispered, stirring the pot that bubbled over Aunt Zilpha's fire. "And power, child, that's something they don't think we're supposed to have." But it was Aunt Zilpha herself who provided the most crucial teaching of all: how to transform suffering into strength, how to take the very weapons used against you and turn them into instruments of justice. She'd seen it before, she said, in other places, other times. Seen enslaved people who had learned to use their oppressors' methods against them, who had turned the master's own tools into implements of liberation. "That fork that's been marking you," she said one night when the moon was dark and the spirits walked closest to the world of the living. "That fork don't belong to him no more. Every time it touched your flesh, it took a little piece of his soul and gave it to you. Now it's more yours than his, child. And someday when the time is right, you're gonna claim what's rightfully yours." She taught Ava how to see beyond the immediate pain, beyond the daily humiliation, to the larger patterns that governed their world. How cruelty created its own vulnerabilities, how men who dealt in systematic suffering often became careless in their confidence, how evil that thought itself scientific was often blind to its own weaknesses. "The spirits are restless," she said as autumn turned to winter, and the burns accumulated on Ava's skin like tallies in some cosmic ledger. "They seen what's happening here and they ain't pleased. Change coming, child. I can feel it in my bones. The old ways stirring, the old powers waking up, and you gonna be the lightning rod that brings it all together." The other women nodded in the candlelight, understanding flowing between them without need for words. They could see it too, the transformation taking place in the scarred girl who sat in their circle, the way pain was crystallizing into purpose, the way suffering was being refined into something pure and deadly as distilled poison. They were midwives to a new kind of birth, these women who knew. Not the birth of a body, but the birth of an instrument of justice. They could see the future taking shape in Ava's eyes, could feel the approaching storm in the way she held her silence, could sense the gathering power in her stillness. "God don't sleep," Aunt Zilpha whispered as the fire burned low and the women prepared to return to their own cabins. "He may seem quiet sometimes, but he don't sleep. And when he decides it's time for accounts to be settled, he gonna need human hands to do the settling. Strong hands, steady hands. Hands that know exactly what needs doing and ain't afraid to do it. Looking at Ava in the dying firelight, marked by torture but somehow made stronger by it, the old conjure woman smiled a smile that carried more promise than threat, more certainty than hope. "Your hands, child," she said softly. "Your hands gonna be the ones that balance the books. Now you see, people, there's different kinds of silence in this world. There's the silence of fear, when folks keep quiet because speaking might bring the lash. There's the silence of sorrow, when grief fills up the throat so full that words can't find room to breathe. But there's another kind of silence altogether, the silence of someone who's done talking and started listening, really listening, to everything around them. After them, women finished their teaching. After Aunt Zilpha's words took root in soil that had been prepared by 500 applications of heated iron, Ava settled into a silence that made folks nervous in ways they couldn't quite name. She did her work same as always, kept her head down when the white folks passed, answered when spoken to with "yes, sir" and "no, sir," and all the other words that slavery required. But something had changed in the way she carried herself, something that made even the other enslaved people step careful around her. Lord have mercy. But that child had learned to watch like a hawk watches mice. Every morning when she was summoned to the big house for her cleaning duties, she moved through them rooms like she was taking inventory of everything worth knowing. Which floorboards creaked underfoot, which windows stuck when you tried to open them, which doors had locks that worked proper, and which ones just pretended to keep things secure. She learned the rhythm of the house like some folks learn music. When the master took his morning coffee, when the mistress retired for her afternoon rest, when the children were occupied with their tutors and wouldn't be underfoot. She memorized the pattern of servants coming and going, the schedule of deliveries and visitors, the ebb and flow of daily life that governed the plantation's operations. In the kitchen, she listened to the house slaves gossip about their owners, with the careful attention of a spy gathering intelligence. Miss Caroline was having trouble with her nerves again. Master William had been caught stealing coins from his father's desk. The mistress was taking more and more of her medicine, the kind that came in brown bottles and made her speak too loud and laugh at nothing. But most important of all, Ava studied Master Thornfield himself. She watched him eat his breakfast while reading correspondence from other plantation owners, noting how he held his coffee cup, which hand he favored for writing, how he moved through familiar spaces without looking where he was going. She observed his habits and rituals, the small routines that governed his days, the patterns that made him predictable in ways he'd never intended to be. The man was vain about his appearance, she noticed, spent considerable time each morning arranging his hair and adjusting his cravat, checking his reflection in every mirror he passed. He had a particular way of walking when he thought people were watching, chest out and shoulders back like he was posing for a portrait. But when he believed himself unobserved, his movements became looser, less careful, more vulnerable. She learned that he kept a pistol in the top drawer of his desk, loaded but not primed, more for show than for use. She discovered which books he actually read and which ones just sat on his shelves to impress visitors. She found out that he was afraid of storms, would pace restlessly when thunder started rolling across the sky, drinking more than usual until the weather passed. Most valuable of all, she mapped his relationship with the tools of his trade. The fork that had marked her so many times lived in a wooden box beside the forge, wrapped in oiled cloth like some sacred relic. Thornfield treated it with the reverence other men reserved for family heirlooms, cleaning it carefully after each use, checking its tines for damage, discussing with the blacksmith the proper temperatures for heating iron without making it brittle. Precision instruments require precision care, she heard him tell a visiting plantation owner who had come to observe his methods. Random violence is merely destructive, but systematic application of carefully controlled force, that transforms both the subject and the tool itself. Standing in the corner of the blacksmith shed, emptying ash from the forge as she'd been instructed, Ava listened to every word of that conversation. She learned that Thornfield had commissioned other tools from blacksmiths in Charleston and Savannah, specialized implements for specific types of conditioning. as he called it. But the fork remained his favorite, his most trusted instrument for what he considered his finest work. "The subject has shown remarkable adaptation to the conditioning process," he explained to his guest, both men speaking about Ava like she wasn't standing right there listening to every syllable. "Physical resistance has been completely eliminated, and psychological compliance increases with each session. I believe this case will provide an excellent foundation for a formal treatise on the science of behavioral modification." But what Thornfield didn't realize was that his subject was conducting her own scientific study, gathering data about the man who thought he owned her soul. Every Tuesday and Friday, when she was summoned to the shed for another burning, Ava used the pain as cover for observation. While her body endured the iron's kiss, her mind cataloged details that might prove useful someday. She noticed that Thornfield's hands shook slightly when he first picked up the heated fork, though he steadied them quickly through force of will. She observed that he always stood to her left when applying the iron, positioning himself for maximum leverage and control. She memorized the exact sequence of his preparations, heating the tool, testing its temperature against a piece of scrap wood, approaching her with measured steps that had become as routine as breathing. Most important of all, she studied his eyes. Eyes that held no doubt about the righteousness of his work, no question about the necessity of what he was doing. Eyes that saw her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be destroyed. That kind of certainty, she realized, was a weakness. It made a man predictable, made him careless in ways that someone with less confidence might avoid. Between sessions, Ava perfected the art of appearing broken while remaining whole. She learned to let her shoulders slump just enough to suggest defeat, without actually surrendering her strength. She practiced looking through people rather than at them, creating the impression that her spirit had been successfully crushed, while keeping her thoughts completely hidden behind empty-seeming eyes. The other enslaved people began to avoid her, sensing something in her silence that made them uncomfortable. They'd seen broken people before. Lord knows the plantation was full of souls who'd had the fight beaten out of them. But Ava wasn't broken in the way they recognized. She was something else, something that made old women cross themselves and young men find reasons to be elsewhere when she passed. "That girl gives me the shivers," she heard one of the field hands tell another. "Walks like a ghost, she does, like she's already dead but forgot to lie down." But Ava wasn't dead, she was transforming, the way metal transforms in a forge fire, becoming something harder and more dangerous than what it was before. Every burn had taught her something new about endurance. Every session with the iron had shown her more about the man who wielded it. Every day of apparent submission had actually been a day of preparation for something that was still taking shape in the darkness of her silence. She began to dream of fire, not the consuming flames of destruction, but the controlled heat of a blacksmith's forge. In these dreams, she was both the metal being shaped and the hand that held the hammer. She could feel herself changing, could sense new strengths emerging from places where weakness had once lived. The dreams showed her things that hadn't happened yet, visions of heated iron moving through darkness, of justice delayed but not denied, of accounts that would eventually be balanced with the precision that Thornfield himself had taught her to appreciate. In these midnight visions, the fork that had marked her flesh became something else entirely, transformed from instrument of torture into tool of reckoning. During the day, she carried these dream memories like coals wrapped in cloth, keeping them warm and ready for when they might be needed. She spoke to no one about what she saw in sleep, shared no hint of the future that was taking shape in her mind, like metal cooling into its final form. Patience, Aunt Zilpha had taught her. Patience and preparation. So Ava waited, and watched, and learned everything there was to know about the man who thought he had broken her. She memorized his weaknesses the way other folks memorized prayers, cataloged his vulnerabilities like items in a store inventory. She studied the layout of the big house until she could move through it blindfolded, learned the routine of the plantation until she could predict what would happen when and where. All the while, something grew in the silence between her thoughts, something that fed on injustice and grew stronger with each passing day. The fire that had been meant to destroy her was instead forging her into exactly the instrument that justice would require when the time came for its work to be done. And that time was coming soon. She could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, could sense it in the restless way the spirits moved through the quarters at night, could see it reflected in the worried faces of the women who knew what signs to look for. The silence was almost over. Soon, very soon, it would be time for different kinds of sounds. The sound of heated iron meeting flesh that hadn't asked to be marked. The sound of justice finding its voice after years of being forced to whisper. Crosses. But I must tell you about the day the fork stopped being his and started being hers. Though neither one of them knew it yet. Some changes happen sudden like lightning strikes. Others creep up slow like morning mist. So gradual you don't notice till the whole world looks different than it did the day before. This change was the second kind. A shifting in the balance of things that had been building for months like pressure behind a dam. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, the kind of day when the air still carried winter's bite, but you could smell summer waiting in the wings. Ava had been marked 478 times by then, her body a living testament to Thornfield's scientific methods. But something was different about this particular summons to the blacksmith shed. Something that made the very air feel charged like before a thunderstorm. Lord of Glory, the fork was waiting for her as always, heating in the forge fire till its tines glowed red as sunset. Moses worked the bellows with his usual reluctant efficiency, avoiding eye contact with both his master and the girl who had become the subject of so much unholy experimentation. The smell of hot iron filled the air, mixed with the scent of ash and something else, something that might have been fear if fear had an odor. But this time, when Thornfield lifted the fork from the flames, Ava didn't see it the way she had before. Instead of an instrument of torture designed to break her spirit, she saw something else entirely. She saw a tool that had been shaped by fire, tempered by heat, made strong through the same process that had been meant to make her weak. The irony was so perfect, it almost made her smile. Almost, but not quite. Today marks session 479, Thornfield announced, checking his notes with his usual scientific precision. The subject continues to show remarkable adaptation to the conditioning process. Physical resistance remains minimal. Psychological compliance appears complete. This case will serve as an excellent example of sustained behavioral modification through systematic application of controlled trauma. As he spoke, positioning himself to her left as always, preparing to add another mark to the map of ownership burned into her flesh, Ava felt something shift in her chest. Not her heart, that still beat steady as a drum. Not her breathing, that remained controlled and even. Something deeper, something that had been sleeping and was now beginning to stir. The fork descended toward her shoulder, its heated tines ready to write another lesson in pain across her scarred skin. But for the first time since the burning began, Ava truly looked at the tool that had marked her so many times. She studied its weight and balance, the way Thornfield held it, the angle of approach he favored. She memorized every detail with the intensity of someone who planned to use such knowledge someday. What if the fire listens to me now? The thought came unbidden, floating through her mind like smoke through an open window. Not a question exactly, more like a recognition, understanding that fire was a conversation, and she'd been participating in that conversation for months without realizing it. Every burn had taught her something about heat and metal, about the relationship between flame and flesh, about the transformative power of iron heated to the right temperature. The pain, when it came, felt different somehow. Still agonizing. There was no changing that fundamental truth. But now she experienced it as information, rather than merely suffering. The fork taught her its weight, its reach, the precise pressure required to penetrate skin, the length of time needed to leave a permanent mark. Knowledge that could be filed away for future reference. Excellent response, Thornfield murmured, making his careful notes. No vocalization, minimal physical resistance. The conditioning protocol has exceeded all expectations. Subject appears to have achieved complete psychological integration with the modification process. But Ava's lack of resistance wasn't submission. It was study. While Thornfield congratulated himself on his scientific methods, his subject was conducting her own research, gathering intelligence about the man and his tools that would prove invaluable when their roles reversed. And they would reverse. She knew that now with the certainty of someone who had finally seen the future clearly. That evening, sitting in Aunt Zilpha's cabin while the old conjure woman tended her fresh burns, Ava spoke for the first time in weeks. Her voice came out rusty from disuse, but the words themselves were clear as spring water. "The fork ain't his anymore," she said softly, watching the candlelight dance across the walls hung with mysterious bundles and protective charms. "Every time it touched my skin, it learned something about me. Now it knows my blood, knows my pain, knows my spirit. It's more mine than his, even though he don't realize it yet." Aunt Zilpha paused in her ministrations, her ancient eyes gleaming with something that might have been pride, or recognition, or fearful anticipation. "Child," she whispered, "you starting to understand the deep knowledge. Pain don't just hurt, it connects. That iron's been drinking your essence for months now. When the time comes, it gonna remember who it really belongs to." The old woman reached into her collection of mysterious items, pulling out a piece of metal that had been shaped and blessed, according to traditions that reached back across the ocean to ancestral lands. It was dark with age and handling, smooth as riverstone, warm to the touch despite the coolness of the evening air. "This here's iron from the first ship," she explained, pressing the relic into Ava's palm. "Iron that carried our people across the water. Iron that knew the weight of chains and the taste of tears. It remembers, child. Metal always remembers. And when iron calls to iron, the answer comes." Holding the ancient piece of ship's metal, Ava felt a connection spark between her hand and the relic. A current of understanding that flowed backward through time to touch minds and spirits that had endured the middle passage. The iron whispered secrets in languages that had no words. Knowledge about survival and resistance, about the patient accumulation of power, about justice that moved slowly but never stopped. "That fork that's been marking you," Aunt Zilpha continued, "it ain't just a tool no more. It's a repository. Every drop of your blood it's tasted, every cry it's heard, every moment of your suffering. All of that stored in the metal like memory in a mind. When the right time comes, when the proper words are spoken, that memory gonna be released." Over the following sessions, as the tally approached 500 marks, Ava began to see the fork differently each time it appeared in Thornfield's hands. Where once it had represented his power over her, now it seemed like a messenger carrying reports between them, taking pieces of her pain and spirit into itself, holding them safe until they could be returned with interest. She started speaking to the iron silently during the burning sessions, not with words but with intention and will. "Remember this," she would tell it as it seared her flesh. "Remember who put you to this work. Remember the hand that guided you, the mind that ordered it, the voice that justified it. Remember everything, because someday I'm gonna need you to testify." The pain began to feel like a ritual she was participating in rather than a torture being inflicted upon her. Each application of the heated fork was another deposit in an account that would someday be settled. Another piece of evidence in a case that would eventually come to trial. She was both witness and judge, gathering testimony that would be used when the time for justice finally arrived. By session 490, Ava could feel the fork's weight in her own hand before Thornfield even picked it up. She knew its balance point, its temperature preferences, its willingness to hold heat. She understood its metallurgy better than the blacksmith who had forged it, knew its capabilities better than the man who wielded it. Soon, Aunt Zilpha had promised, very soon now. And Ava could feel the truth of it in her bones, could sense the approaching moment when the long conversation between her flesh and the heated iron would reach its natural conclusion. The fork had learned everything it needed to know about her. Soon it would be time for her to complete her education about it. The transformation was almost complete. The tool that had been meant to break her had instead become her most intimate ally, marked by her blood, seasoned by her pain, educated in her suffering, until it knew her better than she knew herself. When the time came, and it was coming soon, the fork would remember whose hands had really shaped its purpose. Fire calls to fire, iron calls to iron, and justice, when it finally finds its voice, calls to instruments worthy of its work. The fork was ready. The student was ready. All that remained was choosing the proper moment for the lesson's final chapter to begin. Some conversations take months to complete. This one between Ava and the iron was almost finished, and when it ended, the world would be a very different place for everyone who had participated in its long and painful dialogue. Mercy me, but there are nights when even the spirituals fall silent, when the very air holds its breath like it's waiting for something terrible and necessary to be born. The night I speak of now was such a night, heavy with promise and thick with the kind of darkness that presses against your skin like wet wool, making every soul on that plantation feel the weight of what was coming. It was the last Tuesday in March, when the dogwood blossoms hung white as shrouds in the moonlight, and the night-blooming jasmine filled the air with perfume sweet enough to make angels weep. But underneath all that beauty lay something else, a tremor in the earth itself, a stirring in the spirit world that made the old women light extra candles and whisper prayers in languages that reached back across the ocean, to shores none of them would ever see again. Lord, have mercy on what I witnessed that evening, for I was there among the living and the restless dead, watching as the final pieces of a long and terrible puzzle fell into their appointed places. The quarters were quieter than they'd been in living memory. No work songs drifting from the cabins, no children's laughter echoing across the yard, no sound at all except the whisper of wind through Spanish moss and the distant cry of night birds calling warnings to their kind. Aunt Zilpha had been restless all day, pacing her cabin like a caged panther, muttering words in Gula that made the bottles hanging from her eaves sing in harmonies that raised goose flesh on anyone who passed. She'd been burning sage and sweetgrass since sunrise, filling the air with smoke that carried messages to spirits who dwelt in the spaces between what is and what might be. The crossroads is opening, she told the women who gathered in her cabin as the sun went down red as blood. Time for all debts to be paid, all accounts to be settled. The spirit's been waiting patient as Job, but patience got its limits, even for the dead. She pulled out her conjuring bowl, the one carved from cypress wood that had grown in water where enslaved folks had drowned trying to escape to freedom. Into it went graveyard dirt and coffin nails, Spanish moss and the bones of animals that had died natural deaths. She mixed it all with rainwater that had been caught during a thunderstorm, stirring with a wooden spoon that had been carved from the mast of a slave ship. Tonight, she whispered, her ancient voice crackling like dry leaves. Tonight the iron remembers who it really serves. The plantation itself seemed to sense what was stirring in the darkness. The big house stood silent on its rise, windows glowing with lamplight that flickered nervous and uneven. Master Thornfield was in his study, reading correspondence from other plantation owners and making notes in his leather journal about future experiments he planned to conduct. But his hand shook slightly as he wrote, and he kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. The overseer Hutchins had taken to drinking more than usual, nervous energy making him pace the veranda with his whip in hand, cracking it at shadows that might or might not have been there. Sweet Mary seemed heavier tonight, more reluctant to snap, like even the leather knew that its time of usefulness was drawing to a close. In the slave quarters, folks moved like sleepwalkers through their evening routines, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. Children stayed close to their mothers' skirts, and grown men found reasons to avoid being alone after dark. The very air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes when all the hair on your arms stands up and your teeth start to ache. But it was Ava herself who carried the deepest stillness, moving through the gathering darkness like smoke given human form. She'd completed her work in the big house with her usual careful efficiency, but there was something different in the way she touched things. The crystal glasses, the silver candlesticks, the fine china that spoke of wealth built on human misery. Her fingers lingered on each item, as if she was memorizing their weight and texture, learning the geography of privilege for reasons only she understood. When she'd finished cleaning the parlor, she'd stood for a long moment in the doorway of Thornfield's study, watching him work by lamplight. He was so absorbed in his writing that he didn't notice her presence, didn't see the way she studied his movements, his habits, his complete absorption in work that he believed made him a scientist rather than a monster. The fork sat in its wooden box on the shelf beside his desk, wrapped in oiled cloth, waiting for tomorrow's session. Tomorrow, the 500th burning, the completion of Thornfield's grand experiment in human conditioning. He'd invited colleagues to witness this milestone, planning to demonstrate the perfect compliance he believed he'd achieved through systematic application of controlled trauma. In his mind, Ava represented the successful conclusion of months of careful research, proof that human nature could be scientifically reconstructed through precise application of suffering. But as she stood watching him in the lamplight, Ava felt the weight of different knowledge pressing against her consciousness. 500 sessions had indeed created perfect understanding, but not the kind Thornfield imagined. She understood exactly how much pressure was needed to guide a heated fork through yielding flesh. She knew precisely how long iron retained heat after being removed from fire. She'd memorized the angle of approach that would penetrate deepest, the grip that would provide maximum control. When she finally turned away from his doorway and walked back toward the quarters, every step felt like prophecy being fulfilled. The path was the same one she'd walked countless times before, but tonight it felt like she was walking toward a crossroads where past and future would meet and settle their accounts in blood and fire. The night sounds were wrong. Too quiet in some places, too loud in others. The owls hooted warnings from the live oak trees, and somewhere in the distance, hounds were howling like they'd caught scent of something that made their primitive brains remember older, darker times. The very stars seemed to pulse with unnatural light, as if the cosmos itself was holding its breath. Back in Aunt Zilpha's cabin, the conjure woman was completing preparations for work that would be remembered long after all the participants had joined their ancestors in whatever realm awaited those who had endured the particular sufferings of the enslaved. She mixed powders that sparkled in the candlelight, spoke incantations that made the very air shimmer, called upon powers that had been old when the first Africans were dragged in chains to American shores. "The wheel is turning," she murmured, watching smoke rise from her ceremonial fire in patterns that only she could read. What was scattered is being gathered. What was broken is being made whole. What was silenced is finding its voice. Outside, the plantation settled into an uneasy sleep, but sleep would bring no rest to anyone that night. Dreams would be troubled, filled with visions of iron and fire, of accounts being tallied and debts being called in. The spirits of all those who had suffered and died on that blood-soaked land were stirring, drawn by the approaching moment when justice would finally find its instruments and its voice. The night was almost over, but morning would bring no dawn, only the red light of reckoning that had been building for months like storm clouds on the horizon. Tomorrow would see the completion of an education that had begun with a heated fork and would end with the same tool serving a very different kind of instruction. Somewhere in the darkness, iron was calling to iron, and the conversation that had started with Ava's first scream was preparing to reach its inevitable conclusion. The night without songs was ending, and when the sun rose, the plantation would wake to find that the world had changed in ways that no amount of scientific theory could explain or control. The crossroads was opening, the spirits were gathering, and in a few short hours the fork would remember exactly who it had always truly belonged to. Great God in heaven, but I must tell you about the morning when fire met its match, and the fork remembered its true calling. Some reckonings come with trumpets and fanfare. Others arrive quiet as sunrise, inevitable as the tide. This one crept in on cat feet, soft and silent as Spanish moss swaying in a breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and the promise of justice too long delayed. Tuesday morning dawned red as fresh blood, the sun rising through mist that clung to the earth like the breath of restless spirits. Master Thornfield woke early, excited about the day's work ahead. 500 applications of his scientific method. 500 precise lessons in the reconstruction of human nature. He dressed with particular care, selecting his finest waistcoat and polishing his boots until they gleamed like black mirrors. His colleagues would be arriving within the hour, learned men from Charleston and Savannah who had come to witness the completion of his landmark experiment in behavioral modification. He'd prepared detailed charts showing Ava's progress from defiant child to perfectly compliant subject, documentation that would establish his reputation as a pioneer in the scientific management of human property. Today marks a turning point in our understanding of enslaved psychology, he'd written to Professor Morrison from the medical college. The subject has achieved complete integration with the conditioning protocol. Resistance has been eliminated. Compliance is absolute. This case will serve as the foundation for a comprehensive manual on systematic behavioral reconstruction. But while Thornfield prepared to demonstrate his mastery over human nature, forces beyond his understanding were gathering in the darkness that still clung to the edges of dawn. In Aunt Zilpha's cabin, the old conjure woman was completing work that had begun the moment the first iron touched Ava's skin. Powders that had been blessed under dark moons, words that reached back to African shores, intentions that had been shaped by generations of accumulated suffering. "The spirits are restless," she whispered, her ancient hands moving through rituals that were older than America itself. "They've seen enough. Time for balance to be restored." Ava herself moved through her morning duties with the calm precision of someone who had finally seen the path clearly. She cleaned the big house parlor where Thornfield's guests would gather, dusted the shelves that held his books on human management, polished the windows through which he would soon see the world very differently than he ever had before. When she was summoned to the blacksmith shed for the 500th session, she walked like a woman approaching an altar rather than a sacrifice. The fork was already heating in the forge, its tines glowing red as sunrise, waiting to complete its long education in the difference between justice and cruelty. Moses worked the bellows with tears streaming down his cheeks, knowing somehow that this session would be unlike all the others. The visitors had arrived, 3 men in fine clothes who spoke of Ava like she was livestock being evaluated for breeding potential. They clustered around Thornfield's documentation, examining charts that reduced human suffering to statistical data. "Remarkable consistency in the response patterns," one observer noted, adjusting his spectacles as he studied the carefully recorded measurements. "The psychological conditioning appears absolutely complete. No resistance whatsoever." "None," Thornfield replied proudly, lifting the fork from the flames. "The subject has achieved perfect integration with the modification process. She no longer experiences the conditioning as trauma, rather as a natural and necessary part of her existence." But as he spoke those words, something changed in the quality of light filtering through the shed windows. The air grew thick as honey, charged with electricity that made the metal tools sing in frequencies only the spirits could hear. The fork in Thornfield's hand grew heavier, its balance shifting in ways that made him frown with sudden uncertainty. "Unusual," he muttered, testing the weight of the implement that had served him so faithfully for months. "The tool feels different somehow." Ava stood silent in the center of the shed, but her silence had changed character completely. No longer the silence of submission, but the stillness of deep water that appears calm on the surface while powerful currents move beneath. Her eyes, which had seemed empty for so long, now held depths that reflected light in patterns that made the observers shift nervously. When Thornfield approached her with the heated fork, positioning himself to her left as had become his invariable custom, Ava spoke for the first time in months. Her voice came out clear and strong, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the iron tools hanging from the walls. "Fire don't forget," she said simply. The words hit Thornfield like a physical blow, stopping his approach mid-stride. For the first time since the conditioning began, he looked directly into her eyes, really looked, and what he saw there made his scientific confidence crumble like paper in flames. These weren't the eyes of a broken subject. These were the eyes of someone who had been paying very careful attention to lessons the teacher never meant to give. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Said fire, don't forget," Ava repeated, her gaze never leaving his face. "Every time you put that iron to my flesh, it learned something. Learned the feel of your hand, the sound of your breath, the smell of your fear pretending to be righteousness. Now it knows you better than you know yourself." The fork was growing hotter in Thornfield's grip, though logic said it should be cooling. The metal seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and for a moment he could swear he heard voices speaking from within the iron. Voices of all those who had suffered under its touch, all the pain that had been absorbed into the metal like water into dry ground. "Impossible," he stammered, but his scientific certainty was evaporating like morning mist under the rising sun. Metal doesn't retain memory. Tools don't learn. "This is mass hysteria, group delusion brought on by iron remembers," Ava interrupted, taking a step forward for the first time in months. "And iron calls to iron. What's been taken without permission got to be returned with interest." The visitors were backing toward the door now, sensing something in the air that their rational minds couldn't explain, but their primitive instincts recognized as mortal danger. The very walls of the shed seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting like the chest of some enormous sleeping animal that was beginning to wake. Aunt Zilpha's voice reached them from across the plantation yard, raised in a song that was half spiritual and half summoning, calling on powers that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Other voices joined hers, the enslaved people emerging from their quarters to witness what they somehow knew was about to unfold. "The wheel is turning," their voices sang. "What goes around comes around. Justice may sleep, but it don't die." That's when the fork began to move in Thornfield's hand, twisting against his grip like a living thing trying to break free. The heated iron seemed to recognize something in Ava's presence that called to it more powerfully than the will of the man who had wielded it for so long. "No," Thornfield whispered, fighting to maintain control over the tool that had been his most trusted instrument. "This isn't possible. Metals don't—" But his words were cut off as the fork completed its journey from his hand to hers, moving through the air like it was returning home after a long exile in foreign territory. When Ava's fingers closed around the handle, the iron sang with harmonics that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the earth. For the first time in 500 sessions, the fork was in the hands of someone who truly understood its nature, not as an instrument of torture, but as a tool of balance, a means of ensuring that debts were paid and accounts were settled in the currency that cruelty itself had established. The fire hadn't forgotten. It remembered everything, every cry, every plea, every moment of agony that had been offered up to feed the false god of scientific racism. And now, finally, it was ready to give back exactly what it had been given, measured out in precise portions with the same scientific accuracy that Thornfield had always claimed to value. "Your turn to learn," Ava said softly, and the fork in her hand glowed brighter than any flame, ready to begin the final lesson in an education that had taken far too long to complete. "Lord Jesus, there ain't no joy in telling what comes next, no pleasure in speaking the words that must be said. But truth is truth, whether it tastes sweet or bitter, and this truth has been waiting in the shadows for months like a debt collector standing patient on a debtor's doorstep. Some lessons are gentle, taught with kind words and soft hands. Others come hard, delivered with the same tools that were used to teach the original pain. The man who watched suffering all his life could no longer see. That's the truth of it, simple and final as a gravestone inscription. Master Cornelius Thornfield, who had studied pain like other men studied mathematics, who had applied scientific methods to human agony with the precision of a clockmaker, found himself on the receiving end of education, delivered with his own instruments and techniques, suffering so bad but he had it coming. Lord, forgive me for speaking plain, but that man had sown seeds of torture for months, watering them with tears and fertilizing them with screams. What grew from such planting was always going to be a harvest of justice, terrible and exact. The fork moved in Ava's hand like it was coming home after long exile, the heated iron singing with harmonics that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. When it touched Thornfield's face, first the left eye, then the right, precise as a surgeon's blade, The sound he made wasn't quite human. It was the cry of a man discovering that the universe has rules about balance that don't appear in any scientific journal. His visitors fled like rats from a sinking ship, their fine clothes and educated manners forgotten in the face of justice that moved too swift and sure for comfort. They stumbled over each other, getting to their carriages, desperate to put distance between themselves and the reckoning they'd come to witness, but never expected to see turned inside out. But Moses the blacksmith stayed, tears streaming down his face as he watched the wheel of fortune complete its revolution. He'd been forced to heat that iron so many times, had watched it burn innocent flesh while his own hands shook with revulsion. Now he saw the tool return to its true purpose, not creating pain, but balancing accounts that had been left unsettled too long. "Crosses!" Thornfield screamed, his hands pressed to his ruined eyes, blood seeping between his fingers like tears he'd never learned to shed for others. "My eyes! Dear God, my eyes! Help me! Someone help me!" But there was no help coming for a man who had never showed mercy to those who begged for it. The enslaved people gathered outside the shed stood silent as stones, watching justice work with the same careful attention they'd been forced to show his cruelty. Not celebrating. This wasn't a moment for joy, but witnessing the completion of something that had needed doing for far too long. Ava set the fork down careful-like, her movements deliberate as a priest completing a ritual. The iron was cooling now, its work finished, its purpose fulfilled. She looked at the man who had owned her body but never touched her spirit, who had tried to break her will but had only taught her the exact shape and weight of his weaknesses. "Now you know," she said softly, her voice carrying no satisfaction, no triumph, just the flat finality of a debt marked paid in full. "Now you understand what it feels like when someone takes what they want from you without asking permission, without caring if you can bear the cost." Thornfield was rocking back and forth like a child, his scientific composure shattered as completely as his vision. The man who had documented every cry, every plea, every sign of suffering with clinical detachment, was now learning firsthand what his carefully recorded data actually felt like from the inside. "Please," he whimpered, the word coming out broken and strange from lips that had never formed it in earnest before. "Please, I'm blind. I can't see. Help me understand what happened. This isn't possible. Metal doesn't retain memory. Tools don't choose their own purpose." "Iron remembers everything," Ava replied, already moving toward the shed door. "Every drop of blood it tastes, every cry it hears, every moment of pain it causes. You taught it well, Master Thornfield. Taught it exactly what needed doing when the time came for lessons to be returned." The morning sun was fully risen now, burning away the mist that had clung to the earth like the breath of watching spirits. The plantation woke to find its foundation shaken, its certainties turned upside down, its master stumbling blind through rooms that suddenly seemed strange and threatening. The big house that had stood like a monument to white supremacy now felt hollow, its authority cracked like an egg dropped on hard ground. Word spread through the quarters like wildfire, not spoken, but somehow communicated through glances and gestures, through the way people moved and breathed and held their shoulders. The fork had spoken. The fire had remembered. The wheel had turned. Nothing would be the same again. By afternoon, the doctor had come and gone, shaking his head over injuries he couldn't quite explain or fully treat. The eyes were gone, not damaged, but destroyed so completely that no amount of medical skill could restore what had been taken. Thornfield would spend the rest of his days in darkness, dependent on others for the simplest tasks, reduced to the helplessness he had inflicted on so many. The irony was perfect as a mathematical equation. The man who had used sight to oversee suffering could no longer see. The hands that had guided instruments of torture now shook too badly to hold a cup of water steady. The voice that had given orders with supreme confidence now quavered with uncertainty and fear. But perhaps the cruelest justice of all was that Thornfield retained his memory completely. Every session he had conducted, every careful note he had made, every moment of scientific detachment while human beings suffered for his research, all of it remained crystal clear in a mind now trapped behind walls of permanent darkness. In the days that followed, the plantation began its slow collapse. Without their master's seeing eyes to maintain order, the overseers lost their authority. Some of the enslaved people began disappearing into the swamps and forests, following paths that led toward freedom. Others stayed, not from loyalty, but from the certain knowledge that change was coming whether they ran or waited. Ava herself vanished 3 nights after the reckoning, slipping away like smoke in the darkness. Some said she headed north, following the drinking gourd toward the promise of free soil. Others claimed she went deeper south, into the bayou country where escaped slaves could lose themselves in cypress swamps and Spanish moss. A few whispered that she never left at all, but became something more than human, a spirit of justice that moved through the darkness, ensuring that other cruel masters learned the lessons their victims had been trying to teach them. The truth of her fate matters less than the truth of her legacy. The story of Ava and the Fork spread from plantation to plantation, carried by traders and travelers, whispered in hush harbors and sung in coded spirituals. It became a legend that gave hope to the hopeless and fear to the cruel, a reminder that the universe keeps books and eventually all debts come due. Master Thornfield lived another 7 years in his self-made darkness, cared for by enslaved people who showed him more mercy than he had ever shown them. He never regained his sight, never recovered his scientific confidence, never again believed that human nature could be controlled through systematic application of pain. On quiet nights, when the wind was just right, folks said you could sometimes hear him weeping in his study, crying for eyes that would never see again, and for a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be far more mysterious and dangerous than any textbook had prepared him to understand. The Fork itself disappeared the night Ava vanished, though some claimed it appeared years later, in other places where justice needed instruments and wrongs required righting. Iron remembers, after all, and tools that have been properly educated in the difference between cruelty and justice tend to find their way to the hands that know how to use them correctly. The man who had watched suffering all his life could no longer see, but the blind learn to perceive truths that escape those who trust only their eyes. In his darkness, Thornfield finally began to understand what he had really been studying all those months in the blacksmith shed. Not the science of breaking human spirits, but the mystery of how pain transforms into power when it's held long enough and understood completely enough to be turned back upon its source. Some lessons take a lifetime to complete. Others finish in the time it takes heated iron to find its target. But all education leaves its mark, and the scars that matter most are the ones carved into the soul rather than the flesh. The fire had spoken, the Fork had remembered, and justice, after sleeping so long in the shadows, had finally opened its eyes and seen clearly what needed to be done. Sweet Jesus, but the morning after justice visits a plantation ain't like no other dawn you ever seen. The sun still rises, yes, but it shines on a world that's been turned inside out like a coat pocket searched by desperate hands. Everything looks the same from a distance, but up close, nothing fits the way it used to. The very air tastes different, charged with the electricity that follows lightning strikes and leaves the smell of burned certainty hanging over everything. Lord, have mercy on what I witnessed that Wednesday morning, for I was there among the living and the confused, watching as the plantation tried to make sense of what couldn't be explained by any science they knew. The big house stood on its rise like always, but now it seemed smaller somehow, less imposing, like a stage set that had been revealed as painted canvas and wooden props. Master Thornfield hadn't slept. How could a man sleep when his world had been rearranged in ways that made no earthly sense? He sat in his study with bandages wrapped around his ruined eyes, receiving visitors who spoke in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed the day before. Some tried to convince him it had been mass hysteria, group delusion brought on by the tension of the experimental sessions. Others suggested that perhaps the intense heat of the forge had created optical illusions that made events appear different than they actually were. Impossible, he kept repeating, his voice hollow as an empty church on Monday morning. Metal doesn't retain memory. Tools don't choose their own purposes. There must be a rational explanation, a scientific cause for what appeared to happen. But explaining away the evidence was harder than explaining away the man's blindness. Moses the blacksmith had disappeared during the night, taking his skills and his secrets to places where free men could practice their trade without being forced to heat irons for purposes that made their souls sick. The forge stood cold and empty, its fire extinguished for the first time in months, the ashes scattered like prayers carried off by wind that knew more than it was telling. The overseer Hutchins paced the veranda like a man who'd lost his faith in the natural order of things. Sweet Mary hung coiled at his side, but his hand shook when he touched her, and his voice cracked when he called orders that nobody seemed eager to follow. Authority, it turned out, was a fragile thing that depended on everyone agreeing to pretend it was real. When that agreement crumbled, what was left was just a scared man with a leather whip wondering why nobody seemed afraid of him anymore. The enslaved people moved through their morning routines like sleepwalkers in a dream that hadn't quite decided whether to be nightmare or prophecy. They milked the cows and fed the chickens, swept the big house steps and prepared breakfast for masters who barely ate. But there was something different in the way they carried themselves. Shoulders a little straighter, heads held a degree higher, eyes that met yours direct instead of sliding away like they'd been trained to do. Something's changed, the house slaves whispered to each other as they went about their duties. Can't put your finger on it exactly, but something fundamental has shifted in the balance of things. It wasn't just that Thornfield had been blinded, though that was part of it certainly. It was deeper than that, more complete. The entire philosophical foundation of the plantation system had been called into question by events that couldn't be explained through any of the scientific theories that had been used to justify human bondage. If enslaved people could somehow turn the master's own tools against them, if metal itself could choose sides in the ancient struggle between oppressor and oppressed, then what other certainties might prove to be illusions? By midday, riders were arriving from neighboring plantations, masters who had heard rumors of what happened and wanted to see for themselves whether the stories could possibly be true. They gathered in Thornfield's parlor, speaking in low voices about the implications of what appeared to have occurred. If news of this spread too widely, if the enslaved population began to believe that their oppressors were vulnerable in ways previously unimagined, then the entire structure of Southern society might be threatened. "We need to control the narrative," declared Colonel Whitmore from the adjoining county, a man whose own plantation ran on principles even harsher than Thornfield's. This was clearly an accident, a tragic mishap that occurred during legitimate disciplinary procedures. Nothing more, nothing less. But controlling stories was harder than controlling people, and stories had their own ways of traveling that didn't depend on newspapers or official announcements. The tale was already spreading through the invisible network that connected slave quarters across the region. Whispered conversations between house servants who visited the market, coded messages embedded in work songs that carried information faster than the fastest horse, spiritual gatherings in hidden clearings where news traveled on wings of prayer and hope. Ava turned the iron back on him, the story went. Fire remembered whose blood it had tasted. Justice found its hands and its tools, and did what needed doing. The plantation owners tried to impose order through increased patrols and stricter curfews, but fear had taken root on both sides of the racial divide. The masters were afraid that their enslaved workers might suddenly discover powers they hadn't known they possessed. The enslaved people were afraid that the reprisals for one woman's act of justice would be visited upon all of them. Fear made everyone dangerous in different ways. Some of the overseers quit without notice, unwilling to continue work that had suddenly revealed itself to be more hazardous than they'd bargained for. Others became more brutal, as if increasing the level of violence might restore the balance of terror that had kept the system functioning. Neither approach worked. Resignation only weakened the plantation's authority, while increased cruelty only fed the growing sense that the old ways were dying and something new was struggling to be born. Within a week, 3 enslaved families had disappeared into the night, following paths that led toward rumors of freedom. 2 more were discovered planning escapes, though their punishment was lighter than it might have been in previous times. The masters uncertain whether severe reprisals might trigger responses they weren't prepared to handle. The certainty that had once governed every aspect of plantation life was cracking like dried mud in summer drought. Religious gatherings in the quarters took on new intensity. Spirituals sung with harmonies that reached back to African shores while pointing toward promised lands that might actually be within reach. The old conjure woman Aunt Zilpha held court in her cabin like a queen receiving subjects, dispensing wisdom and protection charms to those who sought her counsel. The bottles hanging from her eaves sang in winds that carried omens and warnings in equal measure. "Change is coming," she told visitors who crowded into her candle-lit space. "The spirits done spoke, and once they start talking, they don't stop till their business is finished. What happened to that fork was just the beginning. The real work starts now." Even the white community beyond the plantation began to take notice, though their understanding was filtered through assumptions that prevented them from grasping the full implications of what had occurred. Newspaper editors published carefully worded accounts that described Thornfield's injury as the result of an industrial accident. Ministers preached sermons about the mysterious ways of providence, suggesting that perhaps God had chosen to humble a man who had grown too proud of his earthly accomplishments. But among the enslaved population, a different interpretation was taking hold, one that saw Ava's act not as an isolated incident, but as evidence of larger forces at work in the world. Forces that could not be controlled by whips or chains, that operated according to laws older and deeper than any human legislation. If the tools of oppression could be turned into instruments of liberation, if suffering could be transformed into strength, if the powerless could suddenly discover power that their oppressors never knew they possessed, then perhaps freedom was not as impossible as it had always seemed. The plantation that had once run with clockwork precision now operated in a climate of constant uncertainty. Work continued, but productivity declined as people found subtle ways to resist without directly challenging authority. Tools broke more frequently, requiring repair or replacement. Crops developed mysterious blights that defied explanation. Animals became skittish and unmanageable, as if they too sensed that the natural order of things had been disrupted. As autumn approached, bringing cooler weather and shorter days, the changes that had begun with Ava's act of justice continued to spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Some plantations in neighboring counties reported similar incidents, tools that seemed to malfunction at crucial moments, accidents that befell overseers with suspicious frequency, inexplicable events that challenged the rational explanations upon which the entire system of slavery depended. The fear now had two faces: masters who no longer felt completely secure in their authority, and enslaved people who sensed opportunity but weren't sure how to seize it without bringing destruction upon themselves and their families. It was a dangerous time, balanced on the edge of changes that could lead either to greater freedom or more terrible oppression, depending on how the forces set in motion by one woman's courage played out in the months and years to come. But one thing was certain: the old certainties were gone forever, scattered like ashes from a cold forge. The world that had seemed so solid and unchangeable just a few days before was revealing itself to be more fragile and temporary than anyone had imagined. What would rise from its ruins remained to be seen, but the process of transformation had begun, and like all true changes, it could not be stopped once set in motion. The morning after the impensable had become the first day of a new world, even if nobody yet knew exactly what that world would look like. Listen here, children, for now I must speak about the mystery of what becomes of a soul when it steps beyond the edges of what folks can understand or explain. The destiny of Ava. Lord knows that's a story with more versions than there are stars in the sky, and every one of them carries its own kind of truth, depending on who's doing the telling and what they need to believe about justice in this hard world. Some say she ran. This is the version that the rational minds prefer, the explanation that fits comfortable in ledgers and official reports. According to these tellings, Ava slipped away 3 nights after the reckoning, following paths that led north toward the drinking gourd and the promise of free soil. They say she joined the Underground Railroad, that mysterious network of safe houses and brave conductors who helped enslaved people escape to places where their chains held no legal power. There's evidence for this interpretation, if you know how to read the signs. In the months that followed her disappearance, reports trickled back of a young woman matching her description, seen in various locations along known escape routes. A girl with distinctive scars on her arms and shoulders, helping other freedom seekers navigate the dangerous passage from bondage to liberty. Someone who moved like smoke through hostile territory, appearing where she was needed and vanishing before pursuit could organize. "Saw her in Philadelphia," claimed a freedman who'd made his own escape years earlier. Working with the Vigilance Committee, they was teaching other folks how to read the signs of danger, how to move invisible through enemy territory. Had the look of someone who'd learned patience the hard way, who knew how to turn suffering into strength. Another report placed her in Canada, in the settlements where escaped slaves tried to build new lives from the fragments of their shattered pasts. Here she supposedly established a school for children who had never learned to read, passing on the knowledge that had been forbidden to her own kind in the land of their birth. The teaching was said to include more than letters and numbers, lessons about dignity, about resistance, about the ways that oppressed people could support each other in their struggles for freedom. But there are other stories, darker and more mysterious, that speak of Ava taking a different path altogether. These versions claim she went deeper into the swamplands of South Georgia, into the bayou country, where cypress trees grow from black water and Spanish moss hangs like the hair of drowned spirits. In these tellings, she didn't escape slavery so much as transform it, using the isolation of the wetlands to create something new, a place where the rules of the outside world held no power. "Seen her in the deep swamp," whispered those who traded in such tales. Living with the Maroons and the runaways, the folks who chose the dangerous freedom of the wilderness over the safe submission of the quarters. She was their conjure woman, their wise woman, their keeper of the old knowledge that reaches back across the ocean to African shores. Some of these stories described communities of escaped slaves who had learned to live in harmony with the hostile environment of the wetlands, building homes on stilts above the water, growing crops in clearings carved from the wilderness, defending themselves with weapons forged from the very tools that had once been used to oppress them. Ava, in these tellings, became their spiritual leader, teaching them to see their exile not as loss, but as opportunity to create something unprecedented in American history. Truly free black communities that existed outside the reach of white authority. The most mystical accounts went further still, claiming that Ava had somehow transcended the physical limitations that bound ordinary human beings. These stories spoke of her appearing simultaneously in multiple locations, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, comforting enslaved children in their quarters on the same night she was seen guiding runaway families through treacherous mountain passes. She had become, according to these tellings, something more than human. A spirit of resistance that could manifest wherever justice needed instruments for its work. "She ain't bound by distance no more," the old women would whisper in their circles around flickering candles. "Time and space don't hold her the way they hold regular folks. She's everywhere the suffering is, everywhere hope needs tending, everywhere the fight for freedom requires a strong hand and a steady heart." These supernatural interpretations often included sightings of the fork itself, the iron tool that had been transformed from instrument of torture into symbol of justice. Witnesses claimed to see it appear in the hands of enslaved people who suddenly found the courage to resist their oppressors, glowing with its own inner light as it carved freedom from the very heart of bondage. The iron remembered, these stories insisted, and it continued its work long after its original wielder had passed beyond the need for such crude instruments. There were practical consequences to these various legends, regardless of which version people chose to believe. The mere possibility that Ava might still be alive, might still be working to undermine the system that had tried to break her, served as both inspiration and warning. Enslaved people took heart from the stories, finding in them proof that resistance was possible even under the most desperate circumstances. Masters and overseers, meanwhile, became more paranoid and suspicious, seeing potential rebellion in every glance and gathering. The different versions of her fate reflected the different needs of those who told and retold her story. Those who required rational explanations spoke of escape and relocation to free territory. Those who needed spiritual comfort told of mystical transformations and supernatural interventions. Those who sought practical guidance found in her tale lessons about patience, preparation, and the proper timing of resistance. But perhaps the most profound interpretation was the one that focused not on where Ava had gone, but on what she had become. In this understanding, her physical fate mattered less than her symbolic power. The way her story had taken root in the collective consciousness of enslaved people throughout the South, providing them with a new mythology of resistance that challenged the narratives of submission and acceptance that their oppressors tried to impose. The plantation where she had been tortured became a kind of pilgrimage site, though the visits were necessarily secret and brief. Enslaved people who could manage to pass through the area would find excuses to walk near the old blacksmith shed, now cold and abandoned, touching the wooden walls where her blood had been shed, and drawing strength from the proximity to a place where justice had finally found its voice. Some left offerings, small items that would not be missed by their owners but that carried deep personal significance. A button from a beloved but dead relative, a smooth stone that had been carried from Africa by an ancestor, a piece of metal that had been shaped by hands that remembered freedom. These tokens accumulated in hidden corners of the shed, creating an informal shrine to the idea that suffering need not be permanent, that the powerless could discover power when circumstances demanded it. The legends grew and changed with each telling, adapting to the needs and circumstances of new audiences while maintaining their essential core of hope and defiance. In some versions, Ava became a general leading armies of liberated slaves against their former oppressors. In others, she was a healer who could cure not just physical wounds, but the deeper injuries inflicted by generations of systematic dehumanization. Still, other stories cast her as a teacher who could show enslaved people how to see beyond the limitations imposed by their circumstances to possibilities that their oppressors insisted didn't exist. What remained constant across all the variations was the central message: that transformation was possible, that the tools of oppression could become instruments of liberation, that individual acts of courage could catalyze changes far beyond what their perpetrators ever imagined. Whether Ava lived or died, whether she escaped to freedom or disappeared into legend, her story had acquired a life of its own that no earthly power could control or contain. The fork, meanwhile, took on its own legendary status, appearing in countless stories as both literal tool and symbolic representation of justice deferred but not denied. Some claim to have seen it in the hands of other resistance leaders, glowing with supernatural heat as it carved new paths toward freedom. Others insisted it had been broken down and reforged into multiple tools, each carrying a portion of its accumulated power to different locations where such instruments were needed. By the time a generation had passed since the events at Thornfield's plantation, Ava's story had become fully integrated into the folklore of enslaved communities throughout the American South. Children who had never heard her given name knew the story of the fork and the woman who had turned fire back upon its source. Adults found in her tale both warning and promise. Warning that justice delayed too long could manifest in ways that shocked even those who had prayed for it, and promise that no system of oppression, no matter how carefully constructed or scientifically justified, was permanent or unassailable. The destiny of Ava, then, was to become something larger than any individual fate could contain, a symbol, a legend, a living reminder that the arc of the moral universe, though long and often invisible, does indeed bend toward justice. Whether she found freedom in Canada, power in the swamps, or transformation in the realm of spirits, mattered less than what her story had given to those who needed it most. Proof that even under the most degraded circumstances, human dignity could not be completely extinguished, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the meek really could inherit the earth. Her name had become a prayer, a battle cry, a lullaby sung to children who needed to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. And in becoming all these things, Ava achieved a kind of immortality that no earthly power could grant or take away. The immortality of an idea whose time had come, whose truth was too powerful to be contained within the boundaries of any single life or death. Come close now, children of memory, for this is where the telling ends and the remembering begins. Draw near this fire that has burned through every age of sorrow, every season of suffering, every generation that has carried the weight of chains both visible and hidden. What I have spoken tonight ain't just one woman's story. It's the story of all our people, concentrated like medicine in a bottle, distilled like spirits that carry more truth than the flesh can bear all at once. Ava of the Fork. That name walks among us still, though the woman who carried it has passed beyond the reach of earthly accounting. She moves through the quarters of memory like wind through Spanish moss, touching every soul that has ever known the weight of another's ownership, reminding every heart that has ever beaten in captivity that freedom is more than just a word white folks use when they want to feel good about themselves. Listen here, child, for I must tell you true. That plantation where she learned to turn fire back on its source, that place is gone now. Buildings fell to time and weather. Fields grew wild with pine and scrub. Graves lost their markers and blended back into earth that holds too many secrets to count. But the spirits that walk those grounds, Lord have mercy, those spirits ain't gone nowhere. They just waiting for someone to call their names, to remember their stories, to speak their truths into the darkness that keeps trying to swallow our history whole. The fork itself, that iron tool that learned the difference between cruelty and justice, nobody knows for certain what became of it. Some say it was melted down and reforged into other instruments, carrying its accumulated wisdom to places where such knowledge was needed. Others claim it disappeared entirely, returning to whatever realm holds the tools that justice keeps in reserve for moments when human law fails and divine intervention becomes necessary. But I'll tell you what I know for certain. Every time a person who's been ground down by this world finds the strength to stand up and say, "No more," that fork is there. Every time someone takes the very weapon that was used against them and turns it back on their oppressor, that iron is humming in harmonies only the ancestors can hear. Every time the powerless discover power they didn't know they had, that metal is remembering the lessons Ava taught it in blood and fire. You think I'm speaking metaphors? You think this is just pretty words meant to comfort hearts that know too much about suffering? Then you ain't been listening close enough to what the Spirit's been trying to tell you all these years. The tools of oppression can become instruments of liberation, but only when they're wielded by hands that have been educated in the proper use of pain. Not pain as destruction, but pain as transformation. Pain as the fire that burns away everything false and leaves only what's true and strong and capable of enduring. Ava's story spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in soil that had been prepared by generations of suffering and struggle. From plantation to plantation, from quarter to quarter, from mouth to ear to heart to soul, her name carried medicine for wounds that wouldn't heal with any store-bought salve. She became proof that the system wasn't as solid as it pretended to be, that even the most carefully constructed hierarchies contained the seeds of their own destruction. The masters tried to suppress the story, of course. They passed laws against gatherings where such tales might be told, increased punishments for enslaved people caught sharing subversive narratives, brought in preachers who preached submission as the will of God. But stories have their own ways of traveling that don't depend on anyone's permission. They move through work songs and spirituals, through the careful glances passed between people who know how to communicate without words, through dreams and visions that come to those who need them most. And as the years passed and the story grew in the telling, something remarkable happened. Ava stopped being just one woman's name and became a title, a role that could be filled by anyone who found themselves called to the work of turning oppression back on its source. "She's got Ava in her," folks would whisper about a woman who showed signs of the particular kind of courage that refuses to be broken no matter what's done to it. "That one's carrying the fork," they'd say about someone who seemed to be gathering strength from their suffering rather than being diminished by it. Because that's what Ava really was. When you strip away all the legend and look at the naked truth underneath, she was proof that human beings possess something that can't be owned, can't be bought, can't be broken by any earthly force. Call it soul, call it spirit, call it the divine spark that the Creator plants in every heart. Whatever name you give it, Ava showed that it's real, that it's stronger than any chain, and that when it finally decides to speak, the whole world has to listen. The children who grew up hearing her story carried it forward into freedom. The kind of freedom that came with emancipation, but also the deeper freedom that comes from knowing your own worth, regardless of what any piece of paper says about your legal status. They passed it on to their children, and their children passed it on to theirs, each generation adding new chapters while keeping the essential truth intact: that dignity cannot be stolen, that justice cannot be permanently denied, and that sometimes the meek really do inherit the earth. In the decades that followed, when Jim Crow tried to rebuild slavery with different words, Ava's name was whispered in the meetings where people planned resistance to laws designed to keep them in their place. When lynching trees bore their terrible fruit, her story reminded the survivors that evil contains the seeds of its own destruction. When separate but equal tried to dress inequality in legal language, her example showed that some truths are too powerful to be hidden behind comfortable lies. And when a new generation rose up in the 1950s and 60s, demanding rights that had been promised but never delivered, they carried forward the same spirit that had guided Ava's hand when she took hold of that heated fork. The tools were different: boycotts instead of hot iron, organized protest instead of individual acts of vengeance. But the principle remained the same. The oppressor's weapons can be turned against oppression itself when they're wielded by hands that understand the true nature of power. Today, when young folks ask me why these old stories matter, why we need to keep talking about things that happened so long ago they feel like ancient history, I tell them, because Ava's work ain't finished yet. As long as there are people in this world who think their comfort is worth another human being's suffering, as long as there are systems designed to convince folks that they're less than human, as long as there are powers that profit from pain, that's how long we need to remember the woman who showed us that fire can be turned back on those who light it. Her name has become a prayer for the powerless, a warning to the cruel, a promise that justice may sleep, but it never dies. In every courtroom where the poor get the same consideration as the rich, in every workplace where dignity matters more than profit, in every home where children learn that their worth doesn't depend on anyone else's opinion, there Ava's spirit lives and breathes and continues its work. Some names fade with the passing years, worn smooth by time like stones in a river. Others grow stronger, gathering power from each voice that speaks them, each heart that remembers them, each soul that finds strength in their example. Ava of the Fork belongs to this second category. A name that has become more than a name, a story that has become more than a story, a memory that refuses to be buried no matter how hard some folks try to shovel dirt over the truth. So when you hear the fire crackling tonight, when you feel the heat on your face and smell the smoke that carries more than ash, remember what I've told you. Remember the woman who learned to speak the language of heated iron, who turned the tools of torture into instruments of justice, who showed the world that suffering can be transformed into strength when it's held by hands that understand its proper purpose. The chains rust, children, but the memory don't. The masters die, but the lesson lives on. The plantations crumble, but the spirit endures. And somewhere in the darkness between what was and what's yet to come, Ava of the Fork continues her work, teaching those who need to learn, strengthening those who need to endure, reminding all of us that justice may be delayed, but it's never truly denied. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory. And memory we guard here, in the legends of the lost slave quarters.